Hello, my name is Dejan Bojkov, Grandmaster from Bulgaria. In this clip, I'm going to show you the typical methods of how to attack the critical points in castling position. Usually those are the h7, f7, and g7 points, obviously. All of these can be targets, but in most of the cases, we're trying to attack f7 and h7. G point we can also attack, as it has been shown already in one of the clips, if the opponent has already made a move with that pawn, and if he had fianchettoed the bishop there on g7, if you manage to trade the bishop, that would be a great idea for you, and you can start attacking on the dark squares. But if the pawns are the way that they are, then ideally you want to attack on h7, the pawn which has less defenders. Once that black has castled, the pawn on h7 is not having any defenders other than the king in most of the cases. Sometimes the knight, but the knight you can get easily rid of if you're advancing your pawn, so if you're trading it. So to cut the long story short, let me show you a game between Volokitin and Barev that was played in Russia 2007. It started with the Karakan defense and white chose the advanced line. It's a pretty common line nowadays. White is trying to keep as many pawns on the board as he can, and he is spinning his house with a kingside attack. Actually, this is one little piece of an advice that I want to give you. If you have pawn chains, you can easily understand on which side of the board you're going to attack if you look at the direction of the pawns. If they are pointing on the king side, this means that you should be attacking on the king side. The reason? It's easier for you to have your pieces on that side of the board. They're already pointed towards that side of the board, and also the pawn on e5 has taken the important f6 square from this knight. So the attack should be more successful. Also, it's easier to bring the heavy pieces out, and you can also shift rooks and other heavy pieces as you have extra space on this part of the board. But back to the game. Black played bishop f5, white reacted with knight f3. So far, nothing unusual. Normal development, and black played the move bishop to g6, white played knight e2. Normal development, all of this has been seen before, and white played the typical move knight e1. One idea behind this move could be the advance of the pawns with f4 followed by g4 and f5, but the other idea is to actually shift this knight all the way to f4. And since we're having a position which is more typical for the French defense, it makes sense to break this knight on f4 and to try to attack on the king side, in particular this bishop on g6. Okay, so this knight is going to f3, just replacing his brother on that side of the board, and after the move knight to f5, the other one is coming on d3. The idea being, it wants to jump on f4, but not to capture this bishop. On the contrary, it wants to attack this bishop, but it doesn't really want to take it. It wants to support the advance of the h-pawn. And only when h5 is becoming a very serious threat and black is forced to push the h-pawn, only after that to capture on g6, thus effectively weakening the position of the black pieces. What black did in return was he captured on d4, and he tried to create some problems for his opponent on the d4 square, and then he played bishop h5. He's moving away from this threat that we were talking about, and after knight f4, he traded his bishop on the f3 square. Indeed, he did a lot of moves with his bishop, but he can argue that at least he managed to weaken a bit the position of the pawn on d4, and now indeed, if he has enough time to attack it, he would be having a good game. I actually wonder why did not Barev play the move queen b6, which has been played before that. Maybe white can just defend himself with a move like knight e2 and then start pushing the pawns anyway, or he can play bishop e3. I'm not sure what was he afraid of. In any case, I think that the move g6 that he played is less accurate. If you don't put enough pressure in the center, then you can easily get under the attack on the flank. This is a general rule. And how is white doing this? First of all, he goes bishop to g4. He starts hitting that knight on f5, and for the time being he's preventing his opponent from castling, because if black castles, then simply bishop takes f5 is rather awkward for the second player. He doesn't want to weaken his king side, but if he captures in this direction, the pawn on d5 is hanging. While if he captures in that direction, then this king is very, very weak. So white can go queen to h5, then he can try to shift the rook, and he can try to leave a checkmate on either the open g file or the half open h file. So this is no goal. He played knight to g7 instead of that, but the knight is quite unpleasantly placed on g7, and with his next move, white makes it actually difficult for black to implement his main plan. The main plan for black is to try to bring his pawns on the light squares, and with the bishop to defend the dark squares around the king. But here is a problem. With h5 now, because the king has remained in the center, white can actually blow the position. He can take on e6, and he can open as many files and diagonals for his pieces as he needs. Then take on g6, then take on e6. He is winning 3 pawns in a flash, and then he's taking a fourth one, the one on d5, as he is threatening bishop h6 at the same time. And he's also threatening f4 and f5 and f6 positionally, but after king g7, he's going to take on d5. White has full pawns for the piece. This is a huge pawn chain, which can hardly be stopped in the future. It's like an avalanche. It's taking everything all the way up to the back rank. And therefore, instead of going for this line, Baryev decided to castle. Okay, but like I told you at the beginning, white's position is designed for kingside attack. The question is how to build it. First of all, white does the modest looking move g3. But this move has 2 ideas. No, the first idea is not to defend the knight on f4. The idea is different. He wants to play h4 and h5. So this pawn is defending the h4 square, and the h-pawn is ready to be advanced on h5. This will give a chance to white to make use of the move g3 in another way. The h file is opened, and after king g2 and rook h1, this rook can join the attack, and white is going to start attacking on h7, and eventually on f7, as we're about to see it. This was one of the last moments in which black could have gone for the move h5, and that was probably the best defense for him. Then after bishop e2, knight b8 is a typical idea to try and to put some pressure on the d4 square. Probably Baryev didn't like this one because of the g4. His knight is going to remain locked on g7, and there will be no support for the central attack on d4. But that was the way for him to play. He's suffering here, he's worse, but this was the less evil. He tried to generate counterplay on the c file instead of that with queen c7, the idea being rook c8 followed by queen c2 and eventually to trade the queens. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't have time for that, and after h4 he missed the last chance of playing h5 himself, and this was still the best. And then I suspect that he didn't like this one because on bishop h3, if he goes rook c8, he realized that this is not a good thing for him. There will be this tactical shot, knight takes g6 followed by queen takes g6, and he doesn't have time to chase this queen with a move like queen c2, as he is going to get checkmated. Just check. Well, actually, he's not getting checkmated after queen h6. There is the move queen to h7, but this is bad enough for him as he is losing the knight back and he's down 3 pawns. It's not a great position for him. He is definitely losing. And maybe this is the reason why instead of playing h5, he decided to hurry up and to go rook c8 and to insist on his idea of seizing the c file and eventually trading the queens. If he manages to trade the queens, the kingside attack is going to become useless, and there'll be more valuable factors which are really working for him. In particular, the open c file in his hands is going to give him a chance to double the rooks and eventually to attack the pawns on the second rank, the pawns on b2 and a2, and even that pawn on d4 sometimes from behind or along the c file with his rook. Don't forget about this idea that we have seen before. Knight to b8 and knight to c6. All of these things are going to work very nicely for him, except that he doesn't have time for those, because white goes already h5 and he's ready to open files. The only thing that you need to remember in situations like that is that anytime that your opponent offers you the trade of the queens, not to allow it. Or if you allow it, at least win something in return, like it is here. White is taking on g6, and black doesn't have time to take on d3 because of the in-between check on f7. He's going to lose a very valuable pawn, and then the two bishops with the extra pawn are going to win for white. That's why Bojkov was forced to take on g6, back with the h pawn. Okay, but now white achieved what he wanted to, and remember, keep the queens on the board. Go queen to e3. You're going to use this queen into the attack. Well, white's plan is very simple and very effective. Say, if black does knight to b6, trying to counterattack on the king side, we are making use of the freshly opened file. That was the whole concept in white's play. Open the h file and use it for your rook. Next, rook is coming. Next, this knight is moving away. Next, queen is coming on h6, and checkmate at this king. Actually, something very similar happened in the game after queen to e3. After rook f to d8, white played king g2 anyway, and now black reacted with bishop g5 because he realized that if queen to c2, there'll be knight d3. The queen is excluded, but more importantly, the white queen is opened. And next, what he wants to do is rook h1, give me queen to h6, give me checkmate. The problem for black is that he cannot run. There'll be instant checkmate on h8 if he runs. And if he cannot run, then the only other thing that he can do is to play some ugly move like g5. But we know that the pawns are not moving back. We can simply go rook to h6. And if the queen cannot join the rook in the attack, we can use some other pieces. The other rook, for example, after bishop g2, followed by rook e to h1, and checkmate. This pawn on g5 might be also concerned, so we can go rook f6 even and queen g5 and checkmate on the g file, and white is winning in many ways in this line. So this is why black played bishop g5. He's trying to keep the queen where it is on e3. But the harm has been done already. The h file is opened and nobody can stop the white pieces from flooding the black's camp. Rook h1 first, using the open file, and on queen c2 already white should start looking for decisive blows. In fact, he already had one and he missed it in the game. Probably Volkitin was very concerned about this check on e4. He didn't want to trade his queen, obviously. And therefore, he played, I'll show you what in a moment, he played the move queen to f3, which is allowing the trade of the queens, but he had an idea behind that one. But the way for him to win was to capture on g6 immediately. And that was a nice trick, a nice finishing touch. The threat is checkmate on h8, and therefore black has no time of capturing on e3. There will be checkmate on h8. At the same time, there is another threat. The bishop on g5 is hanging. And if they, for example, take on g6, there will be queen takes g5. White is up a pawn and he's easily winning. Finally, if we move like f6, keeping the two threats on the board, this capture and this capture, white can escape with a check followed by queen to a3, and probably this is the move that Volkitin missed. It's a long move and we are often missing moves like that. And white is still up a pawn and he is still having decisive attack. That was a nice way to finish the game. But the move queen to f3 that he played was also a very good one. Now, the idea is that in case of a move like bishop f4 followed by queen e4, or the immediate queen to e4 as well, well, then simply queen takes e4 and bishop g5, getting rid of the active rook on the half-open file, securing the pawn on d4 and finishing the development, and finally this lost sheep on e4 is going to get eaten by the wolves. There is nothing that they can do. If instead of the move that was played in the game knight f8, black tries queen e4 immediately, then simply queen e4, and the idea that we have seen before here is working in an even better way. Threatening checkmate on h8, threatening the bishop on g5. It's going to be similar to the line that we have seen, with the only difference that the pawn on e4 is still falling, and in the process white won one more on f7, so he will have 2 extra pawns. But why is the move knight to f8 not a great idea? Why is it losing even faster. The reason is that white brought already too many attackers on the king side. He brought the rook on the open file, he has the queen on the half open file. These two are ready to attack, and even that bishop on c1 is helping by hitting the bishop on g5. And there is a decisive continuation. First of all, white captures on d5. He opens the road for his pieces. Bishop on g5 is hanging, but black doesn't have time to capture on c1 himself, as he is getting checkmated. H-file is under the control of the white troops, and there are too many weaknesses which white can use. Knight e7, by the way, is also checkmate. So this means that after knight e5, black has to capture this annoying knight, which he did with the rook. It doesn't really matter if he takes it with the pawn or with the rook. That bishop g5, white won a pawn. That's only temporary actually, because black can recapture on b2, which he did, or even on d4. But then he brought his pieces even closer and closer to the opponent's camp. The threat is obvious. Bishop takes g7. Let's say that black does nothing. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, check and checkmate. And in order to defend against this one, black had to play knight to d7. But this is releasing the control of the f7 square, of the h7 square, and f7 is suffering because of that. So what white does is first he captures on g7, he opens the road for his queen, and after king takes g7, he finishes the game with this beautiful move, rook to h7. Finally, after all this preparation, after the opening of the file, and after bringing his pieces there on the king side, white is finishing the attack with the move rook h7, and black resigned, not wishing to see the checkmate after king h7, queen takes h7 check, king to h6, as if king h8 it's checkmate in one at once, and if king h6 is similar check, the king has to come out, and then queen to f4 is the checkmate. So remember the method that we have seen in this game. First of all, try to build a nice attack by having more pieces on the side of the board. This is of a paramount importance anyway, but bring even more by opening files for your pieces, creating weaknesses, and shifting your pieces towards the king side. Keep your queens on the board, use the weak squares, and finally break through the open file. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.